Fantasy is a massive genre and is notoriously difficult for new writers to get right. When crafting a new fantasy, the biggest mistake I see authors making is deriving most of their ideas from other fantasy. Have you ever photocopied a photocopy? The more removed it is from the original, the more faded it becomes. The same is true with fantasy fiction. Your story can get lost in the sauce of absurdity when you rely too heavily on fictionalizing something that's already fictionalized. Hi everyone, I'm James, an author, editor, and the owner of The Arcanist, an independent publisher dedicated to sharing excellent fantasy fiction. The biggest cause of inauthentic fantasy that lacks verisimilitude is that many of us, myself included, grew up playing Dungeons & Dragons and The Elder Scrolls, or whatever fantasy tabletop or video game you played. Games tend to craft their fantasy as a pastiche of existing fantasy and easily recognizable mythological and historical archetypes. Have you ever read the Appendix N in classic D&D editions? It spells it all out right there. This is fine for games, which are intended to entertain above all else. Literature, which is often entertaining, seeks to evoke other emotions from the reader. This will sometimes make the pastiche approach seem extremely contrived. Another thing I notice is the use of magic as a shortcut. Why research real poisonous plants and illicit substances when you can just make up a magical death flower? We live in a giant world, and there's magic everywhere. I'd like to read more fantasy that prioritizes the whimsy of our actual world. There's a reason why ancient peoples came up with mythologies to explain the unexplainable. In this video, I'll show you how to find magic in our real world that will make your fantasy come across more authentic and grounded. Then, I'll show you excerpts from other fantasy authors on how they employed these methods. Spoiler alert, none of the inspirations I'll talk about today are other fantasy books. Well, the examples are other fantasy books, but the actual sources I'm— Hey there, I'm James and I run the Literary Fantasy Magazine, a biannual publication showcasing powerful, character-driven fantasy. We publish free fantasy stories every other week on our website, and our first issue is available wherever books are sold online. When you subscribe to our yearly catalog, you will get instant access to our first issue and our entire archive. Writers, submissions for issue 2 are closed, but we're always taking submissions for the website. Links are in the description. Now, back to the video. I picked up Globetrotting, Writers Walk the World, edited by Duncan Minshall. And it got me thinking about the evocative language of naturalist and modernist nature writers and traveloguers. This little book, comprised of just 100 pages of curated passages of historical writers, describes the writer's walk. Just a stroll down the road, down a country path, through a busy avenue. The passages range throughout history and depict every continent at specific points in time, sometimes through the eyes of a visitor to a strange land. As I read a passage or two in my downtime, I can't stop comparing the imagery and evocative language these historical authors use to that of my favorite fantasy authors. World building, quest, adventure, these are the most common and important literary devices used in fantasy. But how can you write a compelling description of your character's journey through a boreal forest if you've never even taken a hike? The first lesson that globetrotting teaches to writers is to simply go outside, to live a balanced life, and to write about the things we see, hear, and smell. This is also pushed by Andrew Cohen's The Art of Writing Fiction, which has an entire chapter about journaling things like strolls and mundane days at work so that you can harvest them later for your fiction. This passage by Lady Anne Pernard simply depicts a couple of people climbing a mountain. How could you possibly write something beautiful about that? Well, she'll show us. It is 3,500 feet in height and reckoned 3 miles to the top from the beginnings of the ascent, and the path is squinted in a zigzag way which increases the measurement of the walk. So Mr. Barrow and I, with our followers, set off. We reached the foot of the mountain on horseback and dismounted when we could ride no more. Indeed, nothing but a human creature or an antelope could ascend such a path. First, we had to scramble up the side of a perpendicular cascade of 100 feet, the falls of which must be very fine after the rains, and the sides of which were shaded with myrtles and sugar trees and geraniums. We continued our way through a low foliage of pretty heaths and evergreens, The sun was at last beginning to beat down on our heads. It made me smile to see the signs of human footsteps, and numbers of old soles and heels of shoes which I came across here and there. I suppose relics have lain time immemorial, as leather, I believe, never decays, or not for a great while. It proved that the Dutchmen told fibs when they said that few people had tried to get up this mountain. This passage makes excellent use of subtext. You don't need to know where the author is to get a feel for the lush, mountainous terrain she trods. I don't have a problem with purple prose, but when you're not really sure what the reader should be seeing, such language can get in the way. If anything, take this passage as permission to let your nature scenes speak for themselves. Now, let's look at a passage from the Fellowship of the Ring to see how Tolkien himself paints a similar scene in the secondary world. The woods on either side became denser, the trees were now younger and thicker, and as the lane went lower, running down into a fold of the hills, there were many deep breaks of hazel on the rising slopes on either hand. At last the elves turned aside from the path. A green ride lay almost unseen through the thickets on the right, and this they followed as it wound away back up the wooded slopes onto the top of a shoulder of the hills that stood out into the lower land of the river valley. Suddenly they came out of a shadow of the trees, and before them lay a wide space of grass, gray under the night. On three sides the woods pressed upon it, but eastward the ground fell steep, and the tops of the dark trees, growing at the bottom of the slope, were below their feet. Below, the lowlands lay dim and flat under the stars. Nearer at hand, a few lights twinkled in the village of Woodhall. The masterful quality to this passage is that aside from the mention of the elves and the fictional village of Woodhall, this writing could be placed in the real world at any time. It's truly timeless, evoking the land with simple but lucid description, harnessing the magic he must have felt on an actual hike through such terrain. The advantage to reading old texts like Bernard's is that even if you haven't made such a giant trek on foot, you can get a feel for the language used to describe the nature in beautiful detail. Often the easiest way to craft fantasy that's fresh and exciting is to look at time periods and cultures aside from Dark Ages medieval Western Europe. Moving the focus to other parts of the world and varying time periods can do wonders to dress up your fantasy. Approaching such elements with a character who is a visitor or a foreigner in a distant land is an excellent way to create a captivating lens for the reader to learn about this atypical fantasy setting. To get an idea on how to do that, let's take a look at a passage from Edith Wharton's In Morocco. It is well to bid goodbye to Fez at night, and a moonlight night for choice. Then, after dining at the Arab Inn of Fez El Jid, where it might be inconvenient to lodge, but where it is extremely pleasant to eat couscous under a grape trellis in a tiled and fountain patio, one may set out on foot and stray down the lanes towards Fez Ebali. Not long ago, the gates between the different quarters of the city used to be locked every night at 9 o'clock. And the merchant who went out to dine in another part of the town had to lodge with his host. Now this custom has been given up, and one may roam untroubled through the old quarters, grown as silent as the grave after the intense life of the bazaars has ceased at nightfall. Would you believe that was written in 1920? I'd wager if you told someone this was from a Sofia Samatar book, they'd believe you, assuming they've read A Stranger in Alondria. Which you should. Again, there's nothing special about the prose, but by the author's accurate description of what she saw, in addition to using the correct names associated with them, the imagery is whimsical and strange to the Western audience. The mention of the recently abandoned curfew suggests the culture she's immersed in is going through a massive change. The existence of such a curfew in the first place characterizes the traditional outlook in Fez. Steven Erikson leverages his experience as an anthropologist to weave incredibly detailed and grounded world building. This passage from Deadhouse Gates achieves much of the realistic wonder of Wharton's piece. The red ochre handprint on the wall was dissolving in the rain, trickling roots down along the mortar between the fired mud bricks. Hunched against the unseasonal downpour, Diker watched as the print slowly disappeared, wishing that the day had broken dry, that he could have come upon the sign before the rain obscured it. That he could have gained a sense of the hand that had made its mark here, on the outer wall of the old Falad palace in the heart of Hisar. The many cultures of 7 cities seethed with symbols, a secret pictographic language of oblique references that carried portentous weight among the natives. Such symbols formed a complex dialogue that no Malazan could understand. Slowly, during his many months resident here, Diker had come to realize the danger behind their ignorance. As the year of Dryjna approached, the symbols blossomed in chaotic profusion. Every wall and every city a scroll of secret code. Wind, sun, and rain assured impermanence, wiping clean the slate in readiness for the next exchange. And it seems they have a lot to say these days. The beginning of his description contains telling word choices. Mud bricks, unseasonal downpour, the pseudo-Arabic words of Falad, Hissar, and Dryjna, combined with the pictographic language, suggests an Egyptian or Sudanese inspiration, again making this feel fresh and new to the Western reader without the necessity of making shit up. I think the concept of alchemy has been entirely bastardized by a lot of fantasy. I blame the Elder Scrolls. In some way, the alchemy systems in Skyrim and Morrowind are pretty well thought out in their real-life inspirations, but again, let's return to the metaphor of photocopying a photocopy. Those deriving fictional alchemy and botany from other fictional alchemy and botany are destined to be nonsensical to the knowledgeable herbalist. A passage from Renee Callie is a first-hand depiction of such folk medicine in use. I intended to set out at the end of August, but at that time another sore much larger than the first one broke out on the same foot. I suffered considerable pain, and my foot so swelled that I could not walk. I begged the old woman to procure some baobab leaves. She boiled them and made them into a poultice which I applied to the sore. This allayed the inflammation, and in the course of 2 days I found myself better. Having no rags for a dressing, I was obliged to use a piece of cotton which formed my turban. The old woman did not approve of this. She alleged it would be better to dispense with the poultice than destroy such a beautiful piece of cloth. The baobab leaves soon reduced the swelling on my foot, but the sore continued as large as ever, twice the size of a 6-franc piece. I dressed it with lint, which I had already used, and though washed, it was not very clean and did me no good. My host, who sympathized with my misfortune, told one of his slaves to procure a root, which I recognized as having a caustic quality. He boiled it in water until it became tolerably soft, then bruised a piece with a stone, and made a salve of it. The first day he attended me himself. After washing the wound with water from the decoction, he spread on some of the unctuous paste produced by the root, and then, instead of a rag, he bound a leaf over the sore. That had a strong aromatic smell. The narrator contains a blend of knowledge and ignorance, which evokes this sense of fantasy. She knows much about the baobab leaves, but misjudged their usefulness. She knew little about the caustic root, and her host's application of the derived salve comes off as strange and alchemical as a result. Baobab leaves are not a catch-all healing paste for every story. This passage regards the narrator's journey through Central Africa between 1824 and 1828. For example, the nature of my fantasy series, Dusk and Dawn, What Lies Below releases November 11th by the way, is highly derived from my local area of southern Indiana and western Kentucky. I'm working on a short story that takes place in the ancient fictional version of Mammoth Cave. According to folk medicine of the Mammoth Cave area, a similar scene might regard tobacco leaves instead of baobab. Ingredients and preparation. Mix 1/4 ounce tobacco and 2 ounces of salt water. Dosage, place mixture on sore. C.D. Jensen is an author that strives to write fantasy from a grounded perspective. His secondary world is filled with real medical knowledge. Even his made-up flora and fauna have clear roots in the real world, i.e. his fiction isn't fictionalizing other fiction. Like Erikson, Jensen is an experienced professional, teaching physiology as a tenured professor, and he uses this knowledge to enhance the verisimilitude of his fantasy. But let's indulge that dullness and return to the topic of my tea, and describe the compound that accompanied this morning's nettle. Rindovin, according to the botanist. River laurel, according to the townsfolk. Water poison, according to the poisoner. And a dozen other names according to a dozen other cultures. In the words of Ezrin, the name is the only pointless part of the plant. No matter what you call this one, its flavor remains the same. Deeply pungent, even in the most minuscule dose, which mine obviously was, because my mother wasn't an assassin. She was a medic and a medical botanist. And in small doses, Rindovin has a medical purpose. It enhances immune function by upregulating the body's own natural defense mechanisms. The Rindovin plant doesn't have arms to swat away insects, nor legs to flee from them. so it synthesizes a poison. Woe is the fate of the slugs and grubs that crawl upon its leaf, and woe is the fate of the person who eats a whole leaf in one bite. Eventual woe. It might take a couple of days. Immediate woe belongs to the unfortunate Gaian who eats 3 leaves in one sitting. Numbness, nausea, a sluggish heart rate, low blood pressure, and respiratory depression are the first to arrive. Then finally, respiratory cessation. As far as my Meagle Google search is concerned, Rindavan is fictional. There are mentions of a real-life river laurel, but I don't think it's poisonous. However, there are real varieties of laurels that are poisonous, and I have no doubt as to the authenticity of the qualities of this fictional laurel and the symptoms of ingesting it. Further, the way that this is diegetically presented in a journal format makes the world of Gaia feel massive, which is the goal of any good fantasy world building. There you have it. Solid evidence that pulling inspiration from the real world makes for good fantasy. Of course, you can still pull from your favorite authors and movies and games and what have you, but I urge you to err on the side of caution when photocopying a photocopy or fictionalizing a fiction. There's amazing components to a real world just ripe for the picking. There's still so many mysteries that can inform your fantasy and make for a fresh, authentic read. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Be sure to check out The Arcanist. We publish great fantasy that does all this and more. Issue 2 of the Literary Fantasy magazine will release on July 1st, 2025, and so will several literary fantasy books later this year. Exciting stuff is coming, folks. Join our mailing list to stay up to date. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.